everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. This week you have the pleasure of dealing with myself, Sarah Robertson, and also Sarah Applegate. And this week we're actually going to be talking about hurricanes and insurance and really exciting stuff. And so Sarah Applegate, why I have her here, other than the fact that she's our new director of executive insurance, she is also from Florida, so she knows a ton of stuff about hurricanes. So Sarah, if you would just introduce yourself to our audience.
That is unfortunately true. I'm born and raised in Florida originally. I've been through far too many hurricanes to count. I remember Andrew went right over the top of my house in Naples, and I have been through far more ever since then. This week, of course, we have Dorian kind of plaguing us and causing us a little bit of heartburn, and I wanted to share some information about how hurricane season can actually impact your closing date, because a lot of people don't understand in the insurance world that if there's a hurricane drifting around out there and it might come our way, it can eventually take away our ability to issue a policy and make sure you can close on time. So
that would definitely not be good. So let's talk a little bit about binding restrictions and what that means. So you're saying that essentially if a hurricane is coming into town, like Dorian, they have the potential not to close on their home?
Exactly, yeah. So a lot of the lenders call us and they say, well, I need a binder, right? So binding means coverage is in place. Coverage is going to start on that home on this particular date. So if an insurance company takes a look at the weather forecast and says, you know what, we might get smacked with this hurricane, we're going to temporarily suspend our agent's ability to issue policies in that area until we know better what's going on or until the storm actually clears. So what a lot of clients don't know, and realtors and some lenders don't know, is that when a lender calls us ahead of time to verify coverage, one of the questions they ask us is the policy bound? Meaning, is it issued? Is it sold? Is it actually a policy and not just a quote anymore? And if we cannot answer yes to that, then we could potentially have to delay your closing, because as everyone knows, they have to have closing disclosures at least 3 days in advance. And if we can't provide them proof of actual coverage effective the date of the closing, we'll have to push it out.
Yeah, no, I would just expect that would be a lot of unhappy home buyers.
Especially when this catches them off surprise. Yeah. We had one this week where it was a close call and we had to submit it to underwriting, and it was right in the middle of when Dorian might be heading toward the Carolinas, but they couldn't really tell last Friday and Saturday. And this morning they finally lifted and removed our binding restrictions inland because they had a better idea where it was going, and we were able to get her to closing on time. But the potential for delay is very real, and we do everything that we can to try and get ahead of that when we see something that might come this way.
Yeah, and it's not you guys that are kind of announcing these restrictions. Is it coming from your carriers? So it's pretty much out of your hands. Like, you can't, there's no workaround. There's no, hey, I'm going to slide you a 5 and we're going to get through this. You're pretty much like your hands are tied.
Exactly. And they don't usually give us any lead notice either. It's effective immediately. Binding restrictions are in place for the entire state of North Carolina. That was one that we got on Saturday, actually.
So the whole state. So even if you're not in Wilmington or somewhere on the coast, anywhere in the state, if this goes live.
Exactly. So a lot of times they'll do a blanket over the whole state. So if there's any kind of warning or a watch in place, or the cone of uncertainty, as they call it, might hit that state, they'll do a very broad restriction and shut down the whole state. And then they'll fine tune it later, like what we had happen this morning. So one of our carriers this morning, they said, well, we won't do the whole state anymore. We're going to say these counties, because these counties are near the coast. They're more likely to get impacted, but then everyone else is available to issue policies again.
Okay, so it kind of frees everything up.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything that, you know, our agents and their clients can do to kind of prevent this last minute scramble of getting things? Because you were running around Saturday, right, trying to get policies issued before the hurricane headed our way.
I was at home at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning issuing policies at home, making sure that we got those done. I think we got 4 done that morning. And what I would advise people to do is just to be mindful if you're buying a home or trying to sell your home during hurricane season. It's something to just kind of keep one eye on. If there's something that might head our way, or, you know, if there's any, those lovely spaghetti models, if it might come this way, just kind of keep an eye on it. If you're a home buyer, make sure you've picked a company early enough so that we can bind your coverage without a problem. We went ahead and got about 2 weeks out from when we had the first restriction put in place and made sure everything was issued through, say, the 13th, just to be on the safe side so that coverage was in place and people could still close. We err on the side of caution because we handle so many closings, and we don't want to put one of those in jeopardy just because of a hurricane restriction all of a sudden that was unexpected.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now, let's talk about deductibles. First of all, just starting from the basics, what is a deductible?
That's a good question. We get a lot of that question, especially this time of year, because there's all different kinds of deductibles that can apply, and a lot of people don't understand how they work. Basically, your deductible is your out-of-pocket cost as the homeowner or the property owner that you have to pay out of your own pocket because of a claim. So if you have damage to the home that happens, you have to pay this first dollar amount out of your own pocket, and then the rest would be covered by the insurance policy up to whatever limit of coverage you have.
Okay. And I think we were talking a little bit of getting ready for this podcast. So there are different types of deductibles and kind of what your clients would pay. And a lot of times clients don't even know what they're signing up for until they have someone that reads through all that little tiny print like yourself. But can you talk a little bit about flat versus percentage deductibles?
Yeah, and the other thing that happens is they don't realize what it is until they have the claim. And that's the worst case scenario because it's a surprise that they don't want. So there are two kinds of deductibles traditionally that apply. So a flat deductible is just a flat dollar amount. So a lot of people will see a $1,000 deductible on their policy. That is what's called a flat deductible. We see options from $500 up to $5,000, depending on the insurance company. The other type, the percentage deductible, this is where people can get a little confused. That percentage deductible is based on the amount of coverage that is on your home. So if you happen to look at your policy, there's a line that says the dwelling amount. It's the actual home structure itself. Whatever that amount is, it's a percentage of that. It is not a percentage of the claim, because a lot of people think it's a percentage of the claim amount, and they end up very, very caught off guard because they end up paying a lot more out of their own pocket.
Yeah, I mean, if they have someone that has, a high-end luxury home and they think they're paying, a percentage off of a $10,000 claim, that's totally different than paying a percentage off of the entire price of your home and coverage.
A lot of people pick a higher deductible because they think it's going to save them a lot of money. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not worth it. Sometimes the difference between a $1,000 and a $5,000 deductible financially just doesn't make sense over the course of a year. And we had a client recently, he had an almost $500,000 house, so $500,000 was his dwelling coverage. And the insurance agent in question, which for the record was not us, had quoted a 2% deductible, and he didn't realize it. So 2% on a $500,000 home is 10 grand out of his pocket if he ever had a claim. And this, of course, was upsetting because he didn't understand how it worked. And what I do is I walk people through the math, and I will make sure that they can afford that actual dollar amount at the end of that equation.
And if they get themselves into a situation like this, there is hope, right? They can switch their policy. They're not locked into it. Okay.
Yeah, whenever it gets issued at, you can change that deductible during the course of your policy, unless binding restrictions are in place because of hurricane and things. We can't make any changes to policies during that. But you can make those changes. It's just a matter of being aware of what you've gotten into. We take extra care in making sure people really understand the number. I like to ask people, if you had a claim 3 months from today, what could you really comfortably afford out of your own pocket before you would get stressed financially? It's a different question than what deductible do you want, because it really helps people think about the impact to them and their finances, because that's really where people get into trouble.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, because what can you afford today and what's your monthly payment going to be? And so it's different for every person. So let's kind of move on to all of the different craziness that can ensue from a hurricane, right? So there's wind, there's rain, there's hail, there's flying trees, there's whatever. I mean, we've all seen Twister and the perfect storm and all of those crazy movies.
Day After Tomorrow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm just like rolling through them in my head. I mean, a lot of stuff can happen especially during hurricane season, but all times of year. So, I mean, looking mainly at, what we're talking about now with Dorian. So the wind, the rain. Can you talk a little bit about those different types of claims and what it's going to do to their insurance?
Absolutely. So the most common kind of deductible that we see is called an all-peril deductible. Typically this is I just have $1,000 deductible on my policy. When people say I have $1,000 deductible, this is usually what they mean. All perils doesn't, of course, mean everything. It means everything except these things that are excluded by the contract of the policy. The most common exclusion that people see and are familiar with is flood coverage. Most people understand flood is excluded by homeowners. If you didn't know that, now you do. But flood has to be purchased separately, and it is specifically line itemed as this type of thing is not covered by this policy. Other than that, this type of deductible would apply. Typically, this is a flat amount. We don't see percent deductibles a lot in the all peril area. We see that more when we get into a wind and hail type deductible. So wind being windstorm, can also mean a thunderstorm, because that's really what we get around here. When it comes to deductibles and which one's going to apply, because we have policies that have 2 and 3 types of deductibles on them, it's really a matter of what is the root cause of the claim on the house. Wind and hail is very common. It seems like it's a very clear thing, but if the wind causes the damage to the house, so like you mentioned, flying trees, what made the tree fly? The wind. So if the wind picks up a tree and throws it into the roof of your house, that is still going to be pursued as a wind claim because the wind caused the tree to hit the house. The other thing that it typically includes too is it's generally referred to as wind-driven rain. So if the wind causes damage to the home, or hail causes damage to the home, and the rain enters the home because of the wind or the hail damage, it becomes part of the wind and hail coverage. So a lot of people think water, but if it's driven by the wind or caused by hail causing an opening in the structure, it falls under that. If it's not caused by that and rain just gets in, you're potentially dealing with flood coverage.
Sounds like it could be very confusing.
It is. This is why I think we've scheduled a whole podcast dedicated just to flood insurance later on.
Coming soon. Flood podcast with Sarah Applegate. So I guess with these different types of scenarios, so let's say you have the wind that knocks over a tree and then the rain comes in. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you have your coverage, is that covering you for all of this, or do you need to have individual wind and hail, rain coverage, flood coverage? Is it all separate?
A lot of it is. The excluded stuff on a policy, like your flood, for example, another good example is earthquake coverage. That's typically not included. Those are all things where there just isn't coverage. So your deductible obviously won't apply because deductibles come into play when it's a claim that's covered. Mm-hmm. When it comes to windstorm and hail coverage, that is something we're starting to see more commonly in the Carolinas because we do get a lot of hailstorms. We do get a lot of severe microburst thunderstorms that cause tree limbs to fall. They cause roof damage. Roofs are the #1 claim paid in the insurance industry when it comes to homes. It's literally out there in the open to be hit by all sorts of falling objects. So #2 is water coming from inside the house. That doesn't include flood though. Flood's different because it's rain.
So if they have questions, we'll have them just call you.
Yeah, call me. call this Sarah, not that Sarah. Call the insurance Sarah.
I know this is confusing, guys.
So I mentioned earlier that I've seen policies that have 3 types of deductibles on them. So I will see an all peril, I will see a wind and hail, and I will see what's called a named storm. It sounds pretty straightforward, but people get very confused between a named storm deductible and a hurricane deductible. So named storm is a little more generic. It is a tropical storm or hurricane that is given a name, typically by the National Weather Service. And all of this is outlined specifically in your insurance policy. I realize it's probably not the most interesting read.
Say, of course it is.
Most,
we all read
most
that.
of the insurance organizations defer to the National Weather Service or the National Hurricane Center within the Weather Service. But if it ever hits the point of where it's a tropical storm and it earns a name, like Dorian, that entire system is tracked as having had a name at some point. So it follows the system until it dissipates in most cases. With a named storm, there's also a time limit for the duration of that storm exposure, as they call it. So if there's a warning in place, once that warning ends, there's typically another 24 hours after that ends for it to not be considered part of that system.
Okay.
So any claim that happens during that time period is going to typically be a named storm if you have a named storm deductible. If you don't see any of these fancy deductibles on your policy, you probably have an all-peril deductible, and that's not a bad thing because it's a little more generic, it's not specific, and you're probably not dealing with a percentage deductible. The percentage deductible, we see that more common with wind and hail, named storm, and lastly, our hurricane deductibles, hurricane coverage. So obviously right now, Dorian has reached the status of being a hurricane. If the National Weather Service typically issues a warning for that state, not just that area, but the whole state, they will declare that as a hurricane-based claim. So again, which deductible applies, what's the root cause of the claim, was it the hurricane? And then it goes from there. Claims adjusters get into this in a lot more detail than I do. It's their job to interpret the coverage and make sure it applies correctly. But as a homeowner or a property owner, it's good to know which deductibles you have because the worst time to find out is when you have a tree through your roof.
Yeah.
Or you have something broken on your porch. It's
a little late at that point.
Yeah, and people get very upset very quickly because they just don't understand the math behind it, and that's okay. That's what we're here for. It's our job as insurance agents to explain it in full. And if you don't understand it, call your agent, whoever it is, and they will walk you through this because most of us out there, we really want people to understand what they're getting into. The last thing we ever want to see is somebody get stuck because they can't pay to fix their house.
Yeah.
And they have rain that's come in, they have a lot of damage, they can't live there. It happens. And that's why I always start with a lower deductible and I always ask about what they can really afford.
Yeah. Well, so. And you never think that it's going to be you, you know? It's never going to be your house or the tree next to your window that you've, you know, been looking at for the past 5 years. Of course, that tree would never fall, but.
Exactly. Yeah, it's always when you least expect it that it comes crashing through your deck.
Yeah. So do you recommend, you know, a certain type of coverage just solely based off of a home's like geographical area? Like if you know someone's buying a home on the coast, do you automatically recommend some of these different deductibles?
Well, the interesting thing about that is most of the time the insurance company dictates what we can offer in that area. So depending on where you're located, if you get within a certain distance of the coast, a lot of times they'll require an additional deductible. So you may or may not be able to do your basic all perils. You might have that, but then they might require a wind and hail on top of that. That wind and hail might be higher than your all perils deductible. It's very common for that to be required to be higher than your all perils. So for example, if you pick $1,000 for your all peril, sometimes you'll see $2,000 is the lowest you can get for wind and hail. It just depends on the insurance company because they all have different restrictions. Some of them will say, we'll do an all perils, but then we also require a hurricane deductible. So it really just depends on the company because they have specific underwriting guidelines that we follow, and that's how we end up quoting it. We always still ask the same question though about affordability because even if you have a beautiful house on the coast, not everybody wants to have a $5,000 deductible or a 2% $10,000 deductible on a $500,000 property.
Yeah.
So.
No, that makes sense. So as Dorian, it looks like he's kind of going back out to sea, right? But as Dorian kind of comes through, and we are in the middle of hurricane season, so we have until November 30th, technically speaking. So we don't quite know what exactly is going to be coming this fall, but just make sure that kind of as you are lining up your closings, you keep an eye out for this type of thing. I mean, do you have any other advice for agents that they could relay to their clients in terms of making sure they're covered?
I would definitely say it's not just Florida that gets affected by this. Any of us in the Eastern Seaboard, obviously right now, we're all being affected by this storm system, and everybody said, oh, it's just going to hit Florida in the beginning. Well, it shifted very quickly, and God bless the Bahamas and how long it sat there. But when we see it come up the Eastern Seaboard, every state gets impacted. I mean, we've seen shutdowns from Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina now. Some of these insurance companies shut us down last Saturday as a precaution. Some of them have not lifted it yet either.
Yeah.
Some of them stop it. It's a precautionary measure. I mean, insurance is risk management. If you know a storm's coming, it's a risk that may or may not make sense. So.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And for the listeners, if you have any questions, I'll include Sarah's contact information when we send out the recording of today. And our last little tidbit, Sarah's going to make fun of me, but our last little tidbit for you guys is if there is a hurricane coming through your city and you have some listings, make sure that you take your signs out of the yard, because that's not the way that we want to market yourself to potential clients, is having your yard signs become projectiles. So
yeah, I think the technical term is missile. They become missiles if they're airborne.
And especially if you have your face on your sign, it's not going to be good, I promise you. So
it's not how I would recommend being remembered as a realtor personally. So
no, but everyone be safe through this hurricane, throughout the rest of the fall. And again, if you have any questions for Sarah, she's just a phone call or an email away. Thank you.